So my project is on learned helplessness, and we are comparing and contrasting Martin Seligman's experiment with Eleanor D. Brown's. Learned helplessness is a mental state that occurs when a subject is repeatedly exposed to an unpleasant, uncontrollable experience, resulting in the subject to stop trying to change circumstances. This is first studied by Martin Seligman in the 1960s, and we see it today when students study for exams and don't do well, and eventually stop studying because they feel like they're not getting the results that they want. In the first half of his experiment, he uses classical conditioning, which is a learning process in which two stimuli are paired together and become associated with a response that wasn't previously paired with any response. So he first uses 30 dogs, but ends up with 28 to use in the experiment. And he separates them into two groups, the yoked group and the escaped group. All dogs were uh, put in cages that administered electric shocks for up to 90 seconds. The dogs in the yoked group were unable to escape the shocks, while the dogs in the escaped group were. The dogs in the escaped group, they had to press one of two panels on the side of the box with its head. And the hypothesis was that the animals would learn that the behavior was independent of the shocks. So that was part one or day one, and then day two, the dogs were placed in a cage that had a fence. So it was the same setup where the dogs had to where the dogs had to escape the shocks, but all the dogs this time were able to jump over the fence to escape the shocks. Um, and and the results of that were the dogs in the yoked group who originally were unable to escape the shocks didn't even try to escape the shocks in the second stage, while the dogs in the escaped group who were able to escape the shocks quickly caught on to jumping over the fence to escape it. And the dogs in the yoked group displayed learned helplessness because they had the mindset that they couldn't escape, and they acted like they couldn't escape even though they could have. They didn't try. Part two, well, experiment two, daily poverty related stress and coping associations with child learned helplessness. This is studied by psychologist Eleanor D. Brown, who studies learned helplessness in impoverished children, and studies the links with poverty related stresses. The experiment uses 75 families. The median income was 15,000. 60% of the families were poor, while 40 were low income. This experiment was broken up into three parts. The first part, the parents were interviewed over the phone about their demographics and other information for the experiment. The second part involved phone calls that assessed stress and the coping mechanisms used. Um, the the nine poverty related stressors that were used in the experiment were overload at home, overload at work, family demands, other demands, transportation problems, financial problems, argument with partner, children, and others. So the children were faced with one of those nine, or all nine, or just a variation of either one. And the parents would try to calm them down, and the coping mechanisms were talked about over the phone, and which stress related stressor was used. And then part three, children were given two just jigsaw puzzles. The first one was was hard, and then the second one was not. And they had 180 seconds to complete them both. The results showed that the children who took advantage no sorry they took the sorry the children took an average of 114 seconds to complete the second puzzle, which is the easier one, but 36% of them spent less than a minute on the puzzle because the first puzzle was so hard that they didn't want to try the second one for long. um, so the similarities and differences in these experiments were, the similarities were that both experiments studied people who were somewhat unaware of, or studied things that were somewhat unaware of the experiment being taken place. The children didn't know that they were in an experiment. I'm sure the parents did know because they had to consent and do the first part of the experiment, but the children did not know. So I guess it was more natural. Um, in both experiments, both parties in both experiments, they were linked with having anxiety and depression because of the learned helplessness. Um, now, Seligman, I don't know why spelled Spiegelman. I'll have to erase that. But Seligman, he used dogs instead of people to understand learned helplessness, of course, which he just used that information to apply to people. And his experiment was unethical. The shocks gave the dogs post-traumatic stress disorder, and it was it wasn't healthy. It was a sick experiment. While Brown's experiment was based on people, but just a subset of people, and the her experiments were moral because the parents had consented to the experiment, and the kids weren't put in any harm or danger, or real harm or danger, or physical, I guess, not like with Seligman's experiment. But that is all for my project. Thank you.